Good evening. This lecture is entitled The Space Race, Humankind's Greatest Adventure or Most Expensive Boondoggle. It's for an undergraduate 20th century American history course. In October 1957, the Soviet Union successfully launched the first satellite into space, setting the world into a spin. Nowhere was the impact of this feat felt greater than in the United States of America. The Soviet Union and the United States were in a Cold War with each other, and Sputnik put tensions on an elevated level. The thought among the most senior leaders and many American citizens was that the Soviets would next be placing space bombers up there to drop bombs on the U.S., and there would be nothing we could do to stop them. At the time, the American space program was experiencing nothing but failure, but the Soviet success energized the nation. But it still was not until 1958 that the Americans finally succeeded in launching a satellite, Explorer 1, into space. That same year, the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics was disbanded, and in its place, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, was born. The first major program announcement from the newly created NASA was the future of manned spaceflight and the Mercury program. The selection and announcement of the first 7 American Mercury astronauts in April 1959 was huge news for a country starving for some word of success in keeping up with the Soviets. However, rocket after rocket kept blowing up in the test experiments at the Cape Canaveral launch site in Florida, while the Soviets had a series of successful launches. This comparison of the two space programs led many in America to believe our rockets were inferior to the Soviets, and thus the Soviets were technologically superior to the United States. This belief was reinforced even further on April 12, 1961, when Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to launch into space. He completed one full orbit and returned safely to the Earth. A little over 3 weeks later, though, the Americans finally launched an astronaut, Alan Shepard, into space aboard a Mercury Redstone rocket, providing a much-needed boost to the American space program. However, the Mercury Redstone was a much less powerful rocket than Gagarin's Vostok, so Shepard was not able to reach orbital velocity, so even though an American made it to space, the Soviets were still far ahead in booster technology from what the engineers at NASA could produce. It was not until February 1962, on the third manned flight of the Mercury program, when astronaut John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth in his Friendship 7 spacecraft. The biggest impact of Alan Shepard's flight in May 1961 came a few weeks later in a joint session of Congress when President John F. Kennedy proposed a dramatic goal for the United States. He told Congress and the nation that the United States should commit itself to landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade. Consider this for a moment. The United States had a whopping 15 minutes and 28 seconds of suborbital spaceflight under its belt, and now the President was committing NASA and the nation to the biggest and boldest exploration adventure in the history of mankind. It would require thousands of workers building materials and machines that were not even invented yet, scientists and engineers to figure out the math and procedures for not just getting into space, but staying there and working there for days and then returning safely to Earth. Kennedy was making a bold statement not just for the morale of the American people, but as a challenge to the Soviet Union and the new world competition of high technology and space travel. Just over a year later, nearing the end of the Mercury program, while visiting Rice University in Texas, President Kennedy made perhaps his most famous speech regarding the space program. In this speech, he remarked, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one in which we intend to win." In this speech, Kennedy stated the importance of the space program to the nation as a matter of national pride and as an opportunity for peaceful cooperation, even though the undertones in the halls of NASA and the government reeked of it being a national security issue as well. He qualified it as a noble and necessary objective for the efforts and resources of the United States, and laid out the plans to catch up and eventually pass the Soviets in the race for space. He focused a great deal on the cost for the program and how the benefits sure to be there were still too difficult to ascertain, yet there was a certainty of failure and lost gains if we were to not go at all. Cost of the program would become a major driving factor in the years to come, even with the astounding successes NASA would achieve. Over the next few years, NASA would complete the Mercury program with 6 successful manned flights and 10 manned flights of the Gemini program, with its 2 manned spacecraft paving the way for the Apollo program in the later half of the decade with its 3 manned spacecraft. NASA had a major setback in January 1967 when the 3 astronauts of Apollo 1 died in a fire on the launch pad during a pre-flight test. Congress launched hearings to review the investigation report on the accident, with many thinking that this could be the end of the manned space program due to its cost in money and lives. However, based on extensive engineering analysis and in no small part to the testimony of astronaut Frank Borman, the hearings did not end the program. It did press NASA into a closer oversight of its contractors responsible for the construction and testing of spacecraft and systems for Apollo, and put them back on course for the moon with a new spacecraft and systems checks in times for the first manned Apollo flight, Apollo 7, to launch in October 1968. Then in December that same year, Frank Borman led the crew of Apollo 8 on the first mission to orbit the moon. Through the successes of the Gemini program and the restart of the Apollo program following the Apollo 1 fire, the American space program was far ahead of the Soviets without even reaching the moon yet. In July 1969, Apollo 11 finally succeeded in reaching the goal established by President Kennedy back in 1961, with the first landing on the moon and returning the crew safely to Earth. Another successful landing in November that year still held the imagination and attention of Americans, but by April 1970, interest had waned. It took an explosion aboard the Apollo 13 spacecraft that jeopardized the lives of the crew to bring Apollo back into primetime news cycle. Over the next week, while the whole world watched and waited to see if the 3 astronauts would make it back home, the tempo of questions regarding the cost of the program and why we were still going to the moon after we had beaten the Russians continued to rise. People in Congress began to have strong doubts to the financial responsibility of continuing to go to the moon when there were many other pressing needs on Earth that could benefit from the billions being spent on the space program. In 1970, the Vietnam War was at its height, with hundreds of thousands of American soldiers in country and the draft in progress. Anti-war demonstrations were a regular occurrence, and the bloody results after the National Guard troops fired on students at Kent State in May just added fuel to that fire. The nation was still reeling in the wake of the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy. Civil rights issues and other social and domestic issues at home had many complaining about the money being spent on the moon program when it should be spent bettering the lives of regular American citizens. Much of this angst and anger could be found in the lyrics of the Gil Scott-Heron piece, Whitey on the Moon, released in 1970. Scott-Heron hit some issues that were very close to home for many Americans relating to the increases in taxes, increases in food prices, lack of proper medical care, and availability of housing. Direct shots at NASA and the space program were noted. Was all that money I made last year for Whitey on the Moon? How come there ain't no money here? Whitey on the Moon. Writer Alexis C. Madrigal noted in a column for the Atlantic magazine in 2011 how these words changed the way he looked at the space program. He said it anchored the flight into the heavens, tethering it to the persistence of racial inequality, and pulling it out of the abstract, universal realm in which we like to place our technical achievements. He still agreed that quests such as the Apollo program are noble enough to cross racial divides, yet they do face difficulty in carrying the same weight of importance for everyone. Madrigal noted, to which America went the glory of the moon landing? And what did it cost our nation to put Whitey on the moon? The pressing needs for resources elsewhere, combined with the dropping enthusiasm and public support for the Moon program, motivated Congress to begin making budget cuts on the program as early as the fiscal year 71 budget. At the height of the program, NASA held almost 5% of the entire national budget, but by 1970 it was already less than 2%. Missions for the Apollo program were dropped from 14 total in the beginning to 13, then down to a final number of 11 manned missions. The final mission to the Moon, Apollo 17, returned in December 1972. Funding for NASA and its manned spaceflight program continued to wane in the following years, increasing the delay for any follow-on programs to Apollo. The Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975, the first joint space cooperation effort between America and the Soviet Union, and 3 Skylab missions rounded out the 1970s and the use of all remaining Apollo-era spacecraft and boosters. The next manned program on the books would not see its inaugural flight until 1981 with the launch of the Space Shuttle Columbia. So, was the money spent on the race to the Moon worth it, or could it have been better spent on programs for other domestic and social needs? Many argue it was a colossal waste of money, but others, myself included, firmly believe we should have kept funding levels up and continued advancing our progress in space. Many domestic and social programs, although they may be noble in purpose and intent, are difficult to gauge for success to validate the funding spent on those programs. The space program, though, provided then and continues to provide numerous examples of the value and merit in spending money on space. The Apollo program alone injected billions of dollars in funding for all variety of contracts and services in locations large and small all across the nation, and provided hundreds of thousands of citizens jobs for many skills from highly technical to the general in nature. Technical applications like digital flight controls, rechargeable batteries, Teflon, fire retardant material, air filters, cooling systems, cordless tools, programmable pacemakers, solar panel technology, heart monitors and miniaturized defibrillators, water purification systems, intruder detection systems, heavy load lifting systems, shock absorption and stability improvements for shoes, alternative energy fuels, and many more applications are directly or indirectly related to advances made or discovered as a result of the manned space program. However, there is another measure of success for validation to come from space: inspiration. Kennedy hit on this theme in his speech at Rice in 1962, stating, "For the eyes of the world now look into space, to the Moon and to the planets beyond, and we have vowed that we shall not see it governed by a hostile flag of conquest, but by a banner of freedom and peace." Space was then and is now a frontier more hostile and difficult to overcome than any place else, and it takes dedicated and determined people to be successful in this environment. Kennedy knew this and charged the nation to go forward and do great things in a time when that kind of courage was desperately needed. To echo his closing remarks at Rice that hot afternoon in 1962, he mentioned a comparison of climbing Mount Everest to the space travel and how George Mallory replied when asked, "Why climb the mountain?" And he said, "Because it's there." Kennedy responded, "Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it. And the Moon and the planets beyond are there. And now hopes for knowledge and peace are there. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked." How could one disagree with that position? Thank you very much.